Yeah, I want to flesh out the thesis of this book now. You know, my understanding, the thesis of this book is how the Civil War isn't necessarily an isolated conflict. It's part of a larger global evolution and transformation and movement of nationalism. This is really where we see the rise of nationalism globally. But I do want to sort of define terms before we can continue this discussion. I want to really define what nationalism is. That way, we can sort of fall back on that throughout the rest of this conversation.
Well, the trouble is, as I point out, there's definitions, plural, of nationalism. You've got people like George Orwell are saying, well, the difference between the patriot and the nationalist is a patriot loves his country, the nationalists hate other countries. Um, this is a problem. I can reel off quotes all day about this. But generally, in the 19th century, it took on this idea, very often ethnic, that there was a group of people with a shared culture, mystic chords of memory, as a certain someone put it, and that they deserve to have a state of their own. That is, that they have this right to a territory government of their own. And by definition is exclusionary because some people do not belong to this nation, even if they're actually in it. But it's also very much unifying because everybody who fits the criteria belongs, even if, for instance, they don't believe they do, uh, as some of the people in this book, dispute whether or not they are what they are supposed to be or what they are claimed to be. So it's tricky, but in a lot of ways, it's also buttressed by the rise of the re-energization of religion in this period. There's often religious aspects to it. For example, in the United States, you've got this resurgent Protestantism. Hence, this seeing, for instance, Catholics as an alien force within the US, see the know nothings and all the rest of it. But other nations similarly have this battle over religion and ethnicity. So it doesn't really come down to any one thing. It's a hodgepodge of ideas and concepts that hold people together. There's secular nationalists, there's religious nationalists, there's ethnic nationalists, there's civic nationalists. This is the problem. It's actually quite a protean brute that's quite hard to nail down. Go on, Niels.
Yeah, and I was going to add. I expected Duncan to actually go into the depths of the Westphalian peace and pre-modern nationalism that we debated at length when we wrote the first chapter of the book. But in many ways, what all of this comes down to, whether we're looking at this being an ethnic situation, we still have to kind of define what ethnically, say, makes you like Magyar in Hungary, or what makes you Irish compared to an English person in the Irish lands. So whether this is then religious, whether this is historic, whether this is a cultural or traditional difference, it really becomes a kind of an elite based imagining of a community that is taking place. And that's why Benedict Anderson was very important, sort of from argumentative perspective as we conceived of this, because it is not just that when we talk about nationalism that it is a static thing. It is constantly reinventing thing, reaffirming thing, that when you look at the South, right, you start with Jefferson and Madison sort of as your brainchilds, you get to Calhoun, you get to the 1850s, but that then continues on with the Lost Cause and Confederate memory and monument building, and that is in every civilization the same thing, that we see that they're kind of developing a nationalist idea, and then that gets reformulated over time and new ones start to emerge, right? That by the 1870s, as say the German nation state or the French nation state are becoming more clearly defined as what they are, what it means to be French or what it means to be German, new identities then take on, and you start to see people saying like, no, I'm not just French, I'm also communist, or I'm also socialist, or what have you. So it's just it kind of goes to what Duncan said, this kind of muddled mess of identities that people have, but a lot of these are imagined. That which imaginary bubble do you belong to?
But this is something that, we hope comes out of the book, is that all of us just take nation states for granted. That as human beings, it's quite natural we should be in nation states and they're somehow eternal or immortal. And that's not really the case. As they're entities that have undergone incredible change over time. And this is another thing, they're actually a lot less solid than you often think. And the nations, they're all cut up in transnational movements and issues. Like you can't, unless you're planning on being North Korea, and even North Korea can't do this, you can't shut out all the trends that are going on outside of your little nation state or your little contained area. And you are being caught up in this as well, whether you like it or not. This is kind of one of the dilemmas that nationalists have, one form or another.
It is sort of an evolution over history, this idea of the nation state and nationalism, because we go from this period of imperialism and big empires, and small parts of those empires start to develop identities of their own, cultures of their own. What what do you see as the boiling point in terms of a small group within a larger nation or empire that starts to develop their own identity? When does it hit a boiling point where it justifies secession, rebellion, civil war, to sort of declare their independence as their own nation state?
That's a good one.
Differs, I would say it differs from case to case. I mean, there's people in this world who are oppressed who have not, in fact, risen up and formed a successful nation state. And there's other people who, you know, were subject in retrospect to pretty mild, repression. In some cases, can you call it that? And they nonetheless rebelled. It's not, there's no one, there is simply no hard and fast rule for this. It's certain things you obviously need is you need a literate culture because somebody has to create these myths and they have to be widely disseminated. That's an absolute crucial ingredient. Um, it goes beyond something like Tom Paine's common sense. It just goes to all the myths and stuff that get collected and created. And what is interesting is nation states are almost they're created before they come into existence. Basically, people create this idea of a national identity that almost comes into existence before any proper national identity. There's not a lot of examples in the world where people are suddenly independent and then have to craft a national identity. In fact, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but somebody will find one, I'm sure. But it is kind of interesting, this idea that you have to actually, first of all, imagine your community, to use Benedict Anderson's phrase, and then go about bringing into existence. It is actually this seems to be common to everybody involved.
Well, I think you used a very perfect and fitting word choice there, like the myth, right? That like no one that Lincoln was working with was intending to take all the slaves away and emancipate everyone in the South. But in the mind frame of Southerners, that was exactly what was going to happen. In the same way that like people in Ireland think that the British are engaging in a purposeful genocide to eradicate and thin out the Irish population during the famine, right? Or that the Danish king is trying to incorporate the Duchies of Schleswig-Holstein permanently into Denmark and turn every German into Danes. So it's like it's very much what I in the previous book, like Liberty and Slavery, described as perception. It's all about perception. Like people perceive they're oppressed, people perceive they're wronged, and that gives the impetus to then be like, now I'm going to react. And it's
Catholics are loyal to the Pope, not to the Republic or the kingdom. It's this stuff pops up all the time, and it's interesting how this always does.
Yeah, speaking of myth, I think this is an important aspect in all of this, and that is propaganda. I'm reading Dear Reader right now, which is sort of a unauthorized autobiography of Kim Jong Il of North Korea, and you see how propaganda plays such a big role in nationalism. Can you speak to sort of, in the broader sense of nationalism and all of these conflicts, what role did propaganda play in propagating myths sort of to push agendas and formulate these various identities?
I would say it's fundamental, right? Like, I mean, you like just, I'm going to use the Irish example because I think it's a great one, right? Like, you have national newspapers that they would not think of it as engaging in propaganda. They're like, you have John Mitchell in there and says, you need to learn how to build barricades. You need to prepare for revolution. Um, Speeches that then say, we can't surrender the sword because if we do, we're going to give up everything that is our ability to defend ourselves against oppression. So I don't think the individuals we're looking at would have seen what they're doing as propaganda, but from our modern perspective, it is propaganda that they're propagating a imagining of a community and a defense of that community against an outside or internal other that then can lead to violence.
You also need, I mean, the most successful nation states, I use this term advisedly, are those that basically identify something that most people regard as inherently good, and so that people sign on to that, like liberty. Like, there's not really a lot of people who are don't like the idea of liberty. Okay, um, but it's interesting. Both the British and the Americans claim to be lands of liberty, and to an extent they are compared to some others. On the other hand, if you're Irish, British liberty is not that great. If you're Native American or African American, U.S. liberty isn't that great. Frederick Douglass's "What is the Fourth of July to a Slave?" This is the point. If you start this, these myths and that they create, and Bismarck, when he wants to unify Germans, makes very certain that France declares war on the German Bund. I mean, he makes absolutely sure that he can present this as a defensive war. They're attacking us. This is absolutely critical. So some of this stuff is thoughtful propaganda, but sometimes it's just latching on to ideas that are inherently good and insisting that your state, your people adhere to these or this concept much more than others. And Niels is right. A lot of these people wouldn't see it as propaganda. Um, I believe what Lincoln said at Gettysburg was a sincere expression of his thoughts, insofar as you can tell. I've no doubt what Lincoln said at Gettysburg was what he believed. That is, I think, an honest enunciation of his aims. But it is very much a nationalist speech, and it hits a certain number of concepts Americans have about themselves. In that sense, it works. It is a political speech aimed to win over an audience. It has intent and purpose. And this is also part of nationalist crafting. It's what you do. And everybody does it to some extent. As we make the point, Louis Kossuth probably planted the idea in his head about how to end the Gettysburg Address, because Kossuth was speaking to the Ohio legislature on Hungarian nationalism and what the Hungarians were fighting for, the Magyars were fighting for. It is interesting how this goes across the board.
Yeah, propaganda can also play a role in propagating, like Niels said, this sense of othering people. It's us versus them, which further entrenches that nationalist identity. Which brings me to think, which I think is a very important question to debate: is nationalism a force of unity or division?
Well, I guess that would depend, right? My students always hate when I say that, but it depends. but it depends on who you are, right? If you are the other, it's not a force of union in the state. If you are the force that is othering, it can bring union. Um, in the great scheme of things, I totally get why nationalists other, right? We always do that. It doesn't matter whether it is like some of your listeners are maybe football fans, right? If you're University of Alabama, you need Auburn because that's the other that you need to defeat every November. In the same way that for a long time the British needed France because France was the evil other that needed to be defeated for religious reasons, political reasons. They eat snails and frog legs or whatever it is.
Yeah, the trouble is though, it's a double-edged sword because reality is so far we haven't managed to create any other form of, I'm going to use this term advisedly, democracy, but let's go with representative government instead. We haven't really been able to do it without the nation state. Empires are notoriously not about representative government. So this is the other side of this nation building and nationalism, is it does seem to give people some kind of control over their government. So this is, so you can see the negatives, but there's the positives as well. So it's not simply a question of, oh, it's necessarily inherently wrong. It brings about benefits. It just depends who you are. Niels is right. If you're the other, there's not much in the way of benefits to be had. But very often, if you're part of the larger whole who are in this, there are definite benefits.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Glad you brought up democracy. Do you think that, we see through the Enlightenment the rise of democracy and representative government and liberalism? Do you see that as a precursor to the nationalism movement of the 19th century?
Well, I would think if you ask Giuseppe Mazzini, who is like one of the 19th century brains behind a liberal form of nationalism, and he would say that the two have to emerge and develop concurrently with one another. That the Italian nation can only function well if it is a republic in which all the people have a say. Um, of course, then you look at other places, and that's other thinkers who would disagree with that, and we would see monarchical based nation states, right? Like the German nation state on some level will be, the Italian nation state eventually will be. But I think deep down, some of the foremost thinkers of nationalism in the 19th century would have very much wanted a probably not democratic nation because they didn't necessarily all trust the masses with the requirements of what an intellectually informed citizenship entails. But they definitely would have wanted a nation state that is republican in some form, that has some form of representative body um, governing.
It's a bit of a chicken and egg question because most of these emerging nationalists in the 19th century understood the need for popular support. And so, I mean, and yeah, some of them exploited it, but a lot of them were quite sincere in that they did want to get a sort of general body politic agreeing on things. So it's a bit tricky that way. I mean, again, I've said this in the book. I stress this: the trouble with democracy in the 19th century is over half the population, women, don't have any say. This is why I just prefer representative government. And it's just one of these phrases you just need to be careful bandying about. I mean, women are basically regarded by most Western societies as their husband represents or their father represents their interests, which obviously I'm not thinking a lot of your listeners. Well, I hope not a lot of your listeners are going to agree with that. But this is the issue. I mean, this idea of representative governments changed so much from that point that we're talking about an almost completely different animal in some respects. But I do think this urge to get the people behind you was important. And that, in a sense, kind of brings about almost forces people to be more liberal or more Republican than they perhaps would have been normally. I would suggest that.
For sure. Niels, you mentioned earlier a little bit about the pre-modernist views. That's one thing that you guys talked about in chapter 1 of the book was this modernist versus pre-modernist view of nationalism. Can you sort of explain that and compare and contrast them?
All right. Yeah. I understand this is a simplified version of the debate about nationalism because I'm trying to confine an extremely complex topic into a single chapter. Basically, scholars of nationalism are divided over when nationalism comes into existence. And I kind of divide into the early modernists, and this is an original idea of mine, or the modernists. Early modernists trace it back usually to Westphalia, 17th century. The modernists tend to say no, it's either the French Revolution or the American War of Independence, depends which scholar you read. And it's more or less, as you said, it requires the Enlightenment to bring about the concept of the nation, whereas the pre modernists say, no, 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 the Enlightenment grew out of the existence of the nation state. So it's one of these debates. I did my best. It's interesting because Niels is more of a modernist and I'm more of a pre-modernist. So we did our best to make sure we were fair to both camps in this. I'm sure, people will have their disagreements on that. But I just think in some ways, some states in Europe, I think France, for instance, to me anyway, France strikes me as already got a national identity before the Enlightenment. I don't think the French Revolution creates a French identity. I think the French Revolution augments and develops a French identity. I also think the English have a sense, rather than the British, the English have a sense of who they are as a people before the modern period. So I think the thing is, as I say, it's less important to say when exactly this absolute concept of the nation comes into existence. I think it's just more important to see how it develops. And I do stress again, the 19th century idea of the nation state is quite different to our modern one. We're all civic nationalists now, or most of us are. It's pretty much won the battle. That's simply not the case in the 19th century. The modern welfare state is simply the 19th century. Well, yeah, it comes in with Bismarck a bit at the end, but let's say in the early 19th century, the welfare state would not be comprehensible to them. So this again with nationalism and the nation. It's a concept that keeps changing and developing.
Yeah, for sure. It's an evolution, not necessarily a black and white birth of nationalism, I guess.